So, kia ora. Our first international keynote today is Juliana Cafik from Microsoft, one of our diamond sponsors for today's hui. With over 27 years of experience, Juliana collaborates with the industry to author and drive the adoption of identity standards. As an identity standards architect at Microsoft, her specific focus is on the complex world of policy, governance, trust frameworks, and interoperability, all while ensuring strong security and compliance with regulations to facilitate industry adoption and risk mitigation. Good timing as we move into this. Her role involves a deep commitment to frameworks that enhance trust, privacy, security, adoption, and the interoperability of digital identities and transactions. Her service to the Trust Framework Expert Committee of the Digital Identification and Authentication Council of Canada, which is the Canadian equivalent to digital identity, has given her a rare insight to the inner workings of digital identity trust framework development. We eagerly await Julia's keynote, the international landscape for digital identity trust frameworks, and how New Zealand compares. Please welcome Microsoft's Juliana Cafik.
Wow, thank you. I'll do my best to live up to that. Thank you so much for having me, and New Zealand gave me a very, very warm welcome with a blustery ride into Wellington from Sydney yesterday. I'm really, really looking forward to today and working with you all, understanding all your perspectives, as well as sharing my own. So I'm going to start with, at a very high level, what is the Trust Framework's objective? What's it for? And essentially, it has one core role, and that is to establish trust in digital interactions. And it doesn't matter which type of framework it is, whether it's a digital trust framework that's in effect here in New Zealand, or whether it's a trust framework such as we're all fairly familiar with in payment, where we all know and trust how we present our card can be accepted in a fairly consistent and uniform way. So there are a variety of examples of them from around the world, but I'm going to focus primarily on digital trust frameworks that support trusted digital interactions and strong identity verification. So how does it really work? What does it really do? And so the trust framework establishes a series of rules. And those rules tend to be regionally specific, and they should be, because they're addressing the needs of the individual region and its constituents. It applies specific levels of assurance, whether they're implicit or explicit, and those assurance levels determined the level of trust required for a specific interaction. So buying a movie ticket online is a lower level of assurance than buying or getting a mortgage for $2 million. So the level of assurance is coincident with the type of interaction, and the trust framework applies specific rules to enable those assurance levels to be adopted by the different parties provisioning the products and services enabling those transactions. The next thing it does is it attempts to take those assurance level and apply what are called conformance criteria. How do you actually implement these rules in the context of a specific product or service? And what are they? Attempt to simplify them so they can be adopted and enacted in product. And by combining those rules, the assurance levels, and the conformance criteria, it starts to build a platform to enable confidence and trust. But this is hard stuff. This is really challenging to do, because we have our trust framework that around the world, they are enabled by different regions, different governments. They are primarily standards-based. So they apply the standards that I work on and my colleagues work on from around the world that are very, very detailed specifications for particular credential or transaction capability or authentication mechanisms. They're deeply detailed. And they're all specific. So you can't put them together like Lego blocks and expect them all to work together without building a dynamic relationship between the trust framework, the standards that are being applied, and then applying a lens of user experience, technology, compliance, interoperability, certification, and regulation for a very specific set of interactions, or what we call use cases. Then we have to have product implemented by the private sector. And where the challenge comes with trust frameworks and private sector implementation is every private sector company is going to take those rules, synthesize them, and apply them into their own product. So we may end up, even with consistency across the framework, we may end up with a little bit of divergence from product implementation across specific vendors. So how can we work together, and what can New Zealand do? What can New Zealand learn from other implementations of trust frameworks to ensure its trust framework brings together conformance as opposed to divergence? So global frameworks around the world, there are quite a few, and I'm not going to dive into all of them, but you can see we have a fair number of them at various states of maturity around the world. And New Zealand is no different, but it is in a unique opportunity, or in a unique position, because it can learn from all of the other implementations that are occurring. And that's a huge asset, I believe, right now. So I'm going to dive into three. The first is EIDAS from the European Commission. It's talk of the town in the identity standards world. And what's happening there? So I've applied a very specific lens. Their focus is to enable 80% of EU citizens by 2030. And EIDAS is a legal framework. It's law. And it provides that legal basis, but for very prescriptive and very specific elements: electronic signatures, seals, timestamps, and trusted services. But it's in the law. And so that scope of that framework is to enable identification and trust services across 27 different member states. And each one of those member states has its own methodology for implementing under EIDAS, which is really important to understand. And it's really focused right now on ensuring those member states can interoperate throughout Europe. So a EU citizen can present their credential at any member state, in any member state, and have it recognized and verified. That's where all the energy is going, into that level of interoperability. And then how is that happening in the hands of a consumer is through the EUDI digital wallet. And its job is to enable trusted and secure authentication and attribute sharing. What does that mean? It means that if I have, as the minister mentioned, a mobile driver's license on my phone, that the way that I present that and the way that I authenticate to that is consistent across all of the member states through the wallet. But there may be many, many, many different wallets produced by each of the member states. So that's an important consideration in that framework. The next is NIST. And NIST is US, and it is the National Institute for Standards and Technology. It is not a legal framework, but it is and does provide world-leading technical requirements for federal agencies. So in the US, if a government procures any kind of technology, it must adhere by regulation to the NIST standards. Its real focus is on cybersecurity and digital identity, not just digital identity. So it's an important consideration in the NIST context. It has 4 key volumes focused, and a suite of information conformance criteria associated with each of those key volumes for enrollment and identity proofing, authentication and lifecycle management, federation and assertions. It's really, really detailed, and it's really helpful and is adopted by many organizations around the world, including Microsoft. It helps us to have granular, fine-grained rules that are steeped in cybersecurity and steeped in best practices that we can adopt independent of the region. So they are a very important set of documents from our perspective. And the other difference with NIST is they take a risk-based approach. How do we mitigate risk in these transactions? And what are the ways, methodologies we can implement to do that? The next is DIAC. And their focus is a little bit different. They are focused on identity you can use. And the primary driver for DIAC's inception was out of the economic crisis, and it is attempting, very much so, to drive economic growth through the adoption of digital identity. And it is a true public-private sector collaboration. As a former co-chair of the Trust Framework Expert Committee, I sat at the table with the public sector, private sector, and auditors, so that the components that you see listed there and the conformance criteria related to them not only met the public sector requirements, but were looked at from a private sector implementation lens, which is critical here because someone's got to build this stuff, and from an auditor to ensure that the audit requirements could be met. And that's a really interesting approach on DIAC's side. So New Zealand. Here we are today. I'm going to quote Prasheel, wherever you are in here. I can't see you. Raise your hand, Prasheel. Where are you? Ah, there he is. Okay. So he gave me a great quote that was really important and also married to the minister's statement. And I'm going to I'm not going to read it off, but I'm going to take two words out of it: safe and trusted. This, in my mind, is starting to qualify New Zealand's trust framework in a way. In that the framework is a legal basis for digital identity and accredited services. It's optional, but its goal is to create both safety and trust. And the word safety I haven't seen very often in the context of different trust frameworks from around the world. And that's a really important consideration here. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey on what I've seen in this framework. And I know I'm not going to say that right, so I'm not going to say it. Is New Zealand's trust framework has 5 key elements: identification management, privacy and confidentiality, security and risk, information and data management, and sharing and facilitation. And I'm reading these out on purpose. Those 5 are important contexts. And they're a different way of describing them than I've seen in other trust frameworks. Now, what happens to those 5 when they're being enacted and being accredited is they are related to the accreditation services under the framework and what are known or described as the activities under the framework. This is interesting because what New Zealand's framework in the documents is attempting to create an opportunity or a description of how do we implement these. How do they come together to solve specific challenges? The first is information, and when I synthesize that, the activities are accuracy of personal and or organizational information. Another key point that is distinct within New Zealand that is absolutely powerful because an exchange is between 2 parties, both a person and an organization. I'm going to leave out all the other stuff, machine identity and a variety of other different identity contexts, but the 2 interactions must be able to verify each other, and New Zealand brings that into the context of that framework, and I applaud that. The next is binding of that information. So if I have, through the first process of information, I have verified the information that I have and I bind it to that person or that organization. It's a technical term, but I'm sure you can get what it means, is it's building them together so there's a cryptographic relationship between the two. So I can verify your information, and when you present it, I can verify you are the person presenting that information, which is really important. Authentication, I think we all understand, but there are some real technical elements underneath authentication that ensures that the authenticator that's being used by that person is in fact related to that person and in the control of that person who's presenting the information. And right now, why that's important is we actually don't have an identity problem. We have too much identity problem. Our identity is all over the place and we have no control over it. So we want to make sure that we start to bring it back within the control of the individual, and that they can be assured that who they're interacting with and what they're presenting is in their control, and reciprocally, that whoever is trying to use that information to provide a product or service can verify all of those elements within it. The credential it binds the information, but essentially it's that mobile driver's license that's based on a standard that the ISO community has built in the terms of physical presentation and that we're working on in the context of remote presentation. Is that credential, can we cryptographically verify it in this context? And then facilitation, how? What are the protocols? How do we share that information? This is important because the way the accreditation services in New Zealand work is not directly in line with the components like they are in DIAC. And it is not technically prescriptive as it is in EIDAS. It is not technically steeped in technical security risk documentation like NIST. It attempts to apply the rules of the framework in context of adoption-based context, which is a really interesting perspective and one that I think really needs to be explored, and how can that be leveraged in terms of adoption within New Zealand. So I'm not going to get technical because that's not my jam, but the standards, protocols, and data models are worth discussing in the context of the New Zealand framework for one reason. One, it relies on New Zealand-specific standards for 4 key elements of it. So that is important consideration for multinationals, companies. It's an important consideration for maintaining and making those standards in New Zealand evergreen and in line with the evolving standards around the world. And that's a really important context. So as it can continue to invest in the development of those standards so they can maintain their alignment with other standards and as they develop, and that's a very, very big space right now. Or are they going to start to rely on other areas like NIST, for instance, choice, to evolve the technical standards and then adopt them or reference them within their context? It's a question to be explored in the context of the framework. And then it also relies on international standards, which has an opportunity to continue to do for W3C verifiable credentials and for the driver's license that was described. But those are 2 credential formats. There's a whole lot more underneath to be explored within the context of the framework. I'm going to point out 2 pieces here that I saw in the 5 key elements of the framework, but that are not in the accreditation services. And I'm pointing these out on purpose. One is privacy. So the framework supplements the requirements under the Privacy Act. The next is security. And it attempts to apply governance, best practices, attestation, and risk mitigation. But privacy and security are fundamental elements to what we heard in the minister's statement and to the quote I presented for safety, they're really important, and they're really important to user control, confidence, and trust. And you cannot put them on like a hat afterwards. You can't go through all the accreditation services and then try and figure out, what does the Privacy Act say? What are the security rules I need to adhere to for my particular solution, implementation, or product or service I'm trying to deliver? And synthesize that and try and determine how to apply them in my context. That's where we're going to get divergence of implementation for fundamental things like privacy and security. The framework has an opportunity to take and do that work for them. Create the rules and the accreditation services, and this will be unique, and man, if I could lean into it, I'm happy to help, is can we take each of those accreditation services and then layer in security and privacy component elements and conformance criteria specific to those services? So if you took authentication and you had security practices, conformance criteria, and privacy practices, conformance criteria in there, when an entity is accrediting against the framework, they're doing that whole component, including privacy and security, and it will strengthen the assurance level, and it will increase the likelihood for adoption. And that would be a powerful asset for New Zealand's framework. The next piece is adoption. This is challenging because the maturity level of different frameworks around the world varies. But a lot of it has been academic exercise. A lot of it has been looking at how do we enable our constituents and enable empower users with control of their own data, to allow for broad adoption across the industry, and allow for governments and private sector to be able to consume the information coming from those consumers. But we can't forget that this is also a tactical opportunity, and that technical and standards-based implementations right now in the frameworks are really there to solve regulatory, policy, compliance, and risk-based challenges across the sector. Whether you're a bank for your customer, whether you're a healthcare provider for your patient, whether you're a government for your constituent. So how does the framework become an asset for them? How does it become something that enables them to clearly understand what they have to do to provision those services to enable trust and safety, and then get accredited? How do we make it easier for them? And how do we create this really interesting dynamic between the private sector implementation and the trust framework accreditation, so they're an asset, they're in lockstep together, and there is a true, not just collaboration in the description and the creation of it, but in the use of it over time, because this is going to evolve. That's the only thing we know, is we're going to continue to evolve and we're going to continue to get better, and it's really a powerful asset to be able to do it together. And the other side of it is, the trust framework should not be viewed, in my personal opinion, as another compliance burden for an organization. I already have risk processes, I already have spending X dollars every year to be able to meet my own compliance obligations within the environment I'm in, and now I have another set to deal with. How do we make it an asset for them to reduce their existing risks? They have an identity verification risk today. How does the trust framework help them mitigate it? And how can the details from that framework, the rules and the accreditation, help them get there faster? These are things that are opportunity within New Zealand's context because of the timing we have right now. It's just been enacted. There is a public-private sector stated collaborative effort. There's an opportunity for us to work together. So how do we do that? Well, you can't do it broadly. We have to narrow in, determine what the use case is. Which ones can we start that are most urgent today to try and solve? Is it accessing a bank account? Is it accessing government services? Is it accessing healthcare? Is it all three? Establish what the primary use cases are. Understand the regulatory requirements of them, both from an identity perspective as well as their own regulations. And then understand, look at it now the other way. Let's look at it from the relying parties who have to adopt it. Let's apply their lens to it and understand what their risk management processes are, what their policy and governance requirements are, what their product, how do they implement this within their own product context, and then what is the user experience they're trying to provide to their customer, their patient, their constituent. They're the ones who are going to implement it, and they're the ones who are going to be able to drive adoption into the hands of the holder and put it into effect. I think I'm getting the hook, but this is how we can start to enable those trusted digital interactions in the context of New Zealand's framework. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate all of your time, and I'm looking forward to getting to speak with all of you today.